Hi, everybody. I am Frederick Joseph, the New York Times bestselling author of The Black Friend, Patriarchy Blues, and the forthcoming books Better Than We Found It, as well as Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, The Courage to Dream. And the best advice I ever received, that's a difficult one. The best advice I ever received was not to jump off of a moving car, which is a long story, but that's the best advice I've ever received.
That's pretty good advice, man. Don't jump off a moving car. Like when did that happen, man? Were you like a young kid or
No,
high schooler or what?
so in that period in your early 20s when you feel like you're immortal, right?
Urgh.
I can't remember what it was that I had drank, but it was probably something obscene. And I was completely blasted, and someone had made a bet that, just people, real toxic masculine kind of stuff. Oh, I bet you won't literally, like, he was driving. I bet you won't jump off the cars. I said I can do all sorts of stunts and things like that because I've been doing things since I was younger, like jumping off of swings and things. I was like, yeah, I can do it, right? Like, and this guy's like, jump on my Civic, and then as I'm driving down the street, jump off. I would have probably not been here at this point, so I'm happy I didn't do it.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So that's so interesting. So talk to me about that, man. So you said toxic masculinity, and that's something that I
Yeah.
wanted to absolutely dive into here because I think, first of all, I think people, when they hear it, they just get defensive and they don't even listen to what the heck it is. So can you define that, Fred, as you discuss it, please?
Yeah. So, in my opinion, toxic masculinity, for one, it lives in people who identify in any capacity, right? So, any sex, anyone who identifies with gender, so on and so forth. And it's these traits, these characteristics that are embedded in the worst part of masculine tropes, right? So it's the idea that, for example, to be a man, that means that you're supposed to be uh, physically tough, right? You're supposed to be have a propensity for violence. You're not supposed to cry. It's the same, and that idea, for example, is not just passed down or around amongst men, right? It's passed down and around by women as well, right? Which is why I say, masculinity and femininity, they're not exclusive to any specific groups, right? Within my body, within my spirit, within my soul, my existence, I have feminine traits and I have masculine traits, and I have toxically feminine traits. I have toxically masculine traits, right? And that's the way I view it, and that's something that too often we pass around.
Cool. I think that's a good definition. And anybody who hears that, I don't think there's a reason to be defensive about that. Right. We all have different traits. That's obviously true. You can't really argue with that. I mean, we're not all the same. And secondly, gone overboard, the tropes are what get us in trouble with
Mhm.
this, and put another way, right? That if you believe every stereotype, well, you're in trouble, right? You're gonna get yourself in trouble. And so I think that's really a good jump point here, Fred, to talk about that, because sometimes I think people uh, they need to hear what they don't want to hear, and I'm certainly guilty of that. I grew up in a little town, 996 people. It was really tough, man. And so yeah, so I was not a very diverse youngster. I'll tell you that, man.
Yeah.
So yeah, so with that, I'll tell you, when I read this, when I read the Black Friend, I was like, first of all, I thought about my like young Phil, which I think is important, right? I thought like 14-year-old Phil, like, man, I didn't have any black friends. Heck, I didn't meet a black person, Fred, to be honest with you, until I went in the Navy to join the Navy when I was 17 years old. So
Oh,
it
gee.
was so interesting to read this and then to recognize like as much in common as we might have is as much different as we have. So why, like, what, what was the fire in your belly that prompted you to write this book?
I think that I understood the realities of people living in bubbles around not just our country but the world, right? There's bubbles that I live in. There's things that I don't understand, being a cishet man, and so my thought is there are other people who exist the same way, people who actually do want to change, people who do want to grow. And I think that providing the opportunities to do so for those who want to not only saves them, but it saves all of us, right? I was talking about this last night with a friend, even in regards to Patriarchy Blues. They asked why I decided to write that book, and why I decided to write my first book. And again, it's you see gaps in societies, we should fill them, right? We shouldn't ignore the gaps in societies, because when we fill the gaps in our societies, that's when we can actually build bridges closer to one another, right? We can actually walk across and be in community. You take someone such as yourself, who we're on here right now, but it doesn't surprise me. You grew up in a small town and you didn't have any black friends, you didn't know any black people, and so your propensity to potentially have misinformed views of black people is high, right? Like that just makes sense, especially if people put out disinformation, misinformation about the black community. So then I see it as my job to put out truths, right? Just put out the truth. We should all be, we should all be evangelized by the truth.
Yeah, and not afraid of the truth, right? I mean,
Right.
that's the other thing, is because the truth is the truth, right? You report the news, well, it's the news. Like, you can't argue with that, right? Like, you're wearing a blue hat. Okay, you can't argue with that. That is just obviously true, right? And so,
Right.
I think though sometimes, Fred, the reason we get wrapped around our axle is because of that defensiveness and that challenge. Because if we haven't been exposed, as I see it, and you certainly correct me if I'm wrong here, but I see like there's a continuum of kind of behavior, right? We have ignorance over on one side where we don't have any knowledge, any experience, and I will readily admit that's where I started.
Hmm.
And then we get to, hopefully some understanding, or at least some awareness, maybe. And then I think that's where the fork happens, right? We have the choice. We can either embrace the differences and hopefully respect that, you're different than me, I'm different than you. And, I can love you for the differences. I don't, even if I don't understand them, right? Because we're different. Or I can say, well, that scares me. And now now I think that's bad. And so, talk to me, Fred. Is that what you see, or what? How would you talk about this?
No, I think that you said it marvelously, right? My view on the world is that differences are important. Differences make us unique. I actually make the argument, a lot of people, historically have been colorblind and things like that. And that's problematic because I want to be black, right? I want people to see me as black, but I want that to inform both the beauty and the struggle that they understand that I live with, right? In the same way, I don't want to ignore that someone is Asian. I don't want to ignore that someone is trans. I don't want to ignore that someone is indigenous to a land, right? I want to see the beauty in these things and help dismantle their struggles. Now, again, our differences not only make us us, but our differences are important to acknowledge, because sometimes our differences are the antithesis to somebody else's humanity, right? And that's when it's really important to acknowledge as well, right? Like a difference of someone saying like they're homophobic is not something that's beautiful, right? But it is something I want to acknowledge because I want to destroy that, right? That's the type of difference that I want to dismantle. I want to end that. I want to smite that out, because I think that any difference that specifically aims to destroy someone else needs to be ended.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So with that, right, we see a lot of microaggressions, right? We see those things, and certainly, I would argue those are like the mustard seeds that the bad stuff ends up coming from, right? Because
Yeah,
they're
yeah.
they're little things, right? Like one little thing. Honestly, right? Most of us overlook one thing. People just make a mistake. Okay, but we keep going and we continue to perpetuate that or repeat that. That causes challenges. So Fred, I'm just, I don't know, obviously I'm not black, so I don't know all the microaggressions. So can you, because and every time I see your Instagram, not every time, but many times I see something that I'm like, oh, I didn't even consider that. That wouldn't even enter my mind. So can you talk about those microaggressions and how that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. So, microaggressions are these things that are built over time, and not just pertaining to race, right? It's pertaining to any way that people exist within oppression, right? We form these sometimes ill-informed opinions of other people and things that are, again, either tropes or stereotypes or whatever, that exist within bigoted views, right? So as an example, let's say like where I live, a great example. So I'm about 6'2", right? I'm tall, but I'm not tall enough to be a basketball player or anything along those lines in the grand scheme of things. And oftentimes, especially where I live in a pretty decent neighborhood. People will ask me if I play for a sports team, right? If I play basketball and things like that, right? It's the but that is driven or rooted rather in the assumption that for a black person to live in a decent neighborhood, they must be a professional athlete, right? I have an MBA, I'm a New York Times bestselling author, blah 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 blah, all these different things. No, your sense of what creates black success solely being tied to sports is embedded in racist views, right? Now your intention might not be racism, but it is embedded in a racist view, right? And those are the type of things that again we have to smite out. Like the same idea that someone, let's say, who's gay is going to be extremely flamboyant or things like that, right? That very notion is rooted in homophobia because it means that you're not offering people the full dynamism of their human experience. You're taking one part of who they are, making assumptions about it, and then coloring their entire existence around it, and it's not only unfair, it's bigoted.
That's so interesting. I know that growing up, I saw that a lot because that was the only exposure. But growing up in a small town, I'll just tell you, right? The any people of color, right? They were on TV. First of all, there was no black people in my town, so they're on
Mhm.
TV. So they could have been, they could have been movie stars, right? They could have played on TV, right? Bill Cosby or Oprah Winfrey or any of them, right? Or to your point, right? They played for a sports team, and we didn't acknowledge that they could have just been like our next door neighbor or like your book, right? They could have been our black friends, right? So I think that's super interesting, that lack of that that small view ends up coloring things and making things so awful for folks because of the rootings of that and how that happens. So let's talk about I guess political correctness, because I don't think that even exists, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
a big word. And I've seen you talk about this too. And
yeah,
it
yeah.
always, and it makes me laugh. Like people think, oh, well, people are just more sensitive now than they used to be and they're PC. So Fred, so talk to me about this, man.
You know, I think that this is one of the first times in history where people are truly asking to be respected in their full humanity, right? So, people have to realize that we are only, what are we in 2022 right now? We are less than 70 years removed from the end of segregation, right? The ability for black and brown people to be able to vote, the ability for women to be able to vote, so on and so forth. So realistically, in my mother's lifetime and my grandparents' lifetime, we not only had segregation, but we also had the remnants of enslavement, right? So I think that people conflate humanity, like somebody saying like, hey, treat me as a baseline human, which is what I think that people were fighting for before through like the civil rights movement. It's like, hey, I want to be able to drink at any water fountain. I want to be able to ride the bus and not sit in the back. So we've gotten there, we've gotten that. And then a lot of people are like, okay, great. So that's the end all be all. It's like, no, that is a first step, right? Now I am asking you not to do the microaggressions. I'm asking you not to paint me in certain ways. I'm asking you not to ignore my humanity at its most essential levels. And now people are saying, okay, well, that's too much, right? And that's where we're at, and that's the actual issue. It's not, the issue is not political correctness, it's people's unwillingness to not be bigoted, right? Like someone saying to me, hey, my pronouns are she, her, they. What difference does that make me, right? If it's a way that you feel respected, if I do this and it helps you feel respected, I am happy to help you feel respected. People have no interest too often in other people's baseline asks for respect. That's what's going on. Political correctness is not the issue. Humanity is the issue.
Definitely, definitely. Well, just like our names, right? So your given name is Frederick. I'm Philip Given, but I go by Phil. You go by Fred. though
Yeah.
on the books, right? It's Frederick. So to me anyway, it's the same thing. Like,
Right.
how do you want to be called? It's okay, right? And I think the other challenge here is this challenge of intersectionality that people miss, right? Because it complicates things even more. And if you don't like, if you're not mindful of it and you don't care about it, it's hard to figure out.
Right.
So, where do you see intersectionality kind of challenging things in the patriarchy and making things difficult? And how can we maybe start to break that down?
Well, I see intersectionality challenging things because it forces people to look in the mirror, right? So I've lived my entire life as a black man, but I'm also a cis black man. I'm also a heterosexual black man. I'm also now a black man who once grew up in poverty, but I'm far beyond that now, right? And so I have to acknowledge all the realities that I live in, not just one reality, not just the reality that, oh my God, in white supremacy, I am oppressed. That is true. And also in patriarchy, I have immense benefits, right? In classism, I have immense benefits. In ableism, and so on and so forth, I have immense benefits. And so intersectionality asks us to ask ourselves, really, who are you, right? Like, who are you as a person in relation to someone else? Right, and when you ask that, you start revealing things about the world, right? If I say, like, okay, great example, I used to love jogging. I hate jogging now, but I used to love jogging, and oftentimes I would jog from my apartment. I used to live like on the edge of the city. I used to live in the Upper East Side, and I would jog from my apartment to Central Park, and I would do it at night and just put my headphones on, and I wouldn't have to think about anything but the raccoons in the park, quite frankly, right? I wouldn't have to think about someone grabbing me. I wouldn't have to think about someone assaulting me. I wouldn't have to think about any of those things, right? And for the most part, the park is safe. I didn't have to think about being robbed. But that existence of the things I don't have to think about places me in a beneficial, or rather, I have the benefit of my existence versus, let's say, a woman, right, who is running in the park and maybe deathly afraid because people can assault her, people can harm her, people can rape her, people can victimize her, right? And so I have to look at her experience versus my experience and understand what I can do in society to change that, so that instead of saying I'm going to reduce my benefits, where I can create equity so where she doesn't have to worry about that happening to her.
Fred, why would people argue with that and think that that's not something we'd want? I mean, that just seems so obvious, right? I mean, my wife, right? I want her to have the same stuff I do and not have to think about that, right? I mean, that should just be obvious. And yet I know, like recent studies, it's like 58 cents on the dollar she makes what I would make just
Right.
because, just because I'm a dude, right? So that's really why do people argue about that, man?
I mean, I think that especially in like a capitalistic society, I think we've kind of been falsely taught that for us to be happy, to have um, health and wealth and all the other things we strive for, someone else has to be struggling, right? And
Mm.
and that's one of the greatest lies that I want to undo as an author, as an activist, so on and so forth. Is like there's enough for all of us, right? So people assume that if women, for instance, are paid equally to men, then that somehow means men are going to make less money. And I'm like, well, your issue isn't men making less money. Your issue should be whomever is at the top hoarding all the wealth, right? I'm like, you make $100,000. This woman makes $70,000, but somebody else has $100 billion. You don't see the issue with that, right? Like that's the actual issue. We should be fighting for equity and equality as opposed to, it's basically like somebody has a whole pizza pie and we're all fighting over a slice, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, I've often seen the graphic with a plate of cookies, right? So there's 12 cookies on the plate, and the billionaire has 11 of them, and then you and I are fighting over it, and the billionaire saying, "Hey, Fred's going to take your cookie, man." It's
Right.
like that's not how this works.
That's
I mean,
exactly it. That's exactly it. And it doesn't just happen with, the pay gap between men and women. It happens with with pay gaps and things pertaining to race, geographic location, and so on and so forth, right? Ageism. It happens across the board in every single form that you can think of. We are all being pit against each other to the benefit of other people.
wow, wow. instead of fighting each other, we should probably find a way to make things a little better, right? And maybe
Right.
is that why you wrote? Is that why you wrote Better Than We Found It, Fred? Or what's that all about? Because it isn't out yet, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to lie and say I read it.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have not.
Yeah.
I will. But so tell me about that, Fred. Because is that like the central message, or what's that about?
Yeah. So Better Than We Found It was essentially my wife and I coming together and saying, we want to do something about all the conversations that we're not necessarily having about progress, right? So I've written on race, I've written on patriarchy, I've written on a myriad of things. But I wanted to create something with her that's like, hey, here it is in one place, all these different things to get somebody started or just to like spark something in the brain, right? So we're talking about gun violence and healthcare reform and the military industrial complex and transphobia and homophobia and feminism and how they all actually intersect with each other, right? And to do that, we brought in some of the luminaries of our time. We said, okay, I am an expert in race, I am an expert in patriarchy, but I'm not an expert in gun violence, right? So we went out and got Shannon Watts of Mom's Demand. You know, I'm not an expert in disinformation. So someone who's had been on the receiving end of a ton of disinformation and dealt with it since she was a child. We brought in Chelsea Clinton, right? You know, I'm not an expert in education, so we brought in Elizabeth Warren. I'm not an expert in housing, so we brought in Julian Castro, and all these different people that we brought in to help us essentially create this Bible of progress, if you would.
Cool. So how, like with that, we've got all these different voices. I mean, did you edit that down? I mean, how did that work to collaborate and make that all happen, man? Because that sounds like a lot of work. I mean, I did a co-author once, and I tell you, man, I'm surprised I have hair left. That was tough, bro.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. It's actually the longest of the books that I've written thus far. And had it been the full interviews of these people, for example, the book would have probably been 1,000 words. I mean, 1,000 pages, excuse me.
Wow.
But you know, so we were able to kind of like parse that down into the most digestible and important nuggets. But at some point, I would love to put out like the full interviews because it's you know it's a rare occasion that in like a given day you get to talk to, let's say, Elizabeth Warren, and in that same day, you know, talk to Robert Reich, who's a former head economist in the Clinton administration, right? Like you don't get to do that. So I really wanted to offer that opportunity for people to get their thoughts as these like not only thought leaders, but people who are on the front lines of making the change globally.
Wow. Yeah. And people that we normally don't get access to. That's
Right.
the other thing, right? We don't, I mean, because frankly, Elizabeth Warren as a politician, you're not getting close. Right? I mean, not you, you obviously did, but I'm
Yeah.
not, right? I'm not getting close to that. So that's a cool insight to that. And I think it's really cool that you work on that with your wife. By the way, congratulations on your fresh marriage. That's really cool, man.
Thank you. Thank
That's
you.
really cool. Yep. So congrats to you and Portia. So with that, like, was there anything that they shared maybe that was a big surprise to you that you're like, oh boy, I didn't know anything about that, and now I'm like, wow.
You know, it's interesting. I think that if I'm being transparent, I think the politicians, for the most part, who anyone who's still in politics, did a great job of kind of still, you know, kind of being their political
Being
self.
politicians.
Yeah, 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 yeah. They were very much on brand, on message, and they said important things. But I think some of the most revealing things were actually talking to Chelsea Clinton because our conversation around disinformation is you got to realize so disinformation for those who are not familiar is different from misinformation. That misinformation is just you know someone passing around the wrong information, oftentimes accidentally. Disinformation is people disseminating wrong information purposefully with the goal of making people believe or act in certain ways, right? And the Clinton family has been on the wrong end of disinformation since you know the tabloid in the supermarket era, right? So, you know,
Yeah.
speaking to her was illuminating in how she has felt since she was a little girl, watching people tell lies about her family and then still believing those lies on into her 40s and 50s, right? It's pretty wild. So that was just a very impassioned conversation, and then I think something else that was like really near and dear to my heart. My dear friend Brandon Wolf, who's also writing his first book right now. He is one of the survivors of the Pulse nightclub shooting that took place in Orlando that aimed to murder people in the LGBTQ plus community, and he lost two friends in that shooting that night. And so, in the chapter on gun violence, he recounts nearly that entire night, right? Like from the moment that um, they arrived or were getting ready before going out to the club, and up to the moment that he realized he had lost his friends. And it's such a powerful, um, it's such a powerful reflection because so often we reduce gun violence to hashtags and articles, right? But there are real people behind these instances. There's real loss, and so I think that was one of the other interviews that just really stands out to me at the moment.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, I live about 45 minutes from there. And
Mm,
that's man, that was a tragedy. That's awful, man. That's
yeah,
awful stuff. So it's been not very long at all. So
yeah,
man, holy crap. So yeah, so that's let's that's something that we probably still need to talk about, right? And still need to make awareness. And that's why, having written the book, I think it makes it really important for folks to pick up a copy and really, go deep. And I might say what I've seen of the book, it seems to me like if you pick an essay or an interview and go deep on that and really let it soak in, I think, let that start a conversation. That
yeah.
could really be powerful. Is that what you're hoping happens with the book, Fred?
Yeah, yeah. So the book is not intended, it's kind of like to a certain extent, kind of like my first book, right? Where you can just go to a chapter and read that chapter, read kind of the interview along with that chapter, and then I'll even give you in the back of the book, like, hey, here's these other books, movies you should watch. This is what things mean. And I'm giving people the chance, myself and my wife, to dive deep, like you said, right? Like, I'm not expecting, again, it's a big book. I'm not expecting someone to, it's not like reading Lord of the Rings or something like that. It's not like something you sit with a coffee. It is very much it's a text that you go to and you try to learn something or you begin to become interested in something, right? Like it's written for young people, but it's been illuminating for adults because a lot of times adults are just young people at heart, and a lot of us didn't learn these things when we were younger, right? Like the prison industrial complex, or rather the military industrial complex chapter that I wrote. I had like five people in my wheelhouse read it, and they're just like, I have literally never thought of any of this, right? So I think it's important.
Yeah, definitely, man. I can't wait to read it. So my son is biracial, and definitely a book that he needs to spend some time diving into and learning about. Absolutely, man. So super good stuff. So Fred, your camera conk, buddy.
Oh, sorry about
There we
that.
go. That's all good. So let's as we kind of get closer to wrapping up, I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Black Panther, Wakanda Forever. That's my little guy's favorite superhero, right? Like
Mhm.
truly, between him and Miles Morales, first of all, I'm going to say representation absolutely matters.
Right.
It's super clear, right? But 5 years ago, I wouldn't have known that. I didn't think
Mhm.
about that. Now that I have a biracial son, it is very clear that representation matters, and right that Chadwick Boseman certainly is just someone that we should look up to. So talk to me about how you got involved in this Black Panther event, man. That is really cool.
Yeah, so when the first Black Panther came out, I actually was watching the trailer with my younger brother at the time. And I'm a dork, I'm a nerd. I'm really into comics and things like that. But we were watching the trailer, and I was super excited because I am, invested in this universe. But he at the time he was very small. I can't remember how old he was, but I was watching his eyes as he was watching the trailer, and they had just lit up, right? And I asked him, you seem really excited. Do you know who it is? He's like, no. I'm like, oh, so why are you so excited? He's like, oh, because he looks like me.
Yeah.
And in that moment, I said to myself, it's important that kids see this film. So I created this campaign called the Black Panther Challenge. And then we ended up taking over 70,000 kids to see the film for free around the world. It became the largest GoFundMe in history and so on and so forth. And, one thing led to another, got to meet Chadwick and some of the people close to the film, X, Y, and Z. But then in the years since then, my career is going one path, that franchise is going another path. But it just so happened that I, became a New York Times bestselling writer and wrote many books in the interim. And so there ended up being this random synergy around this film. Like, hey, well, you're a nerd, you did this, and you're a writer. Um, we are looking to create books around this film. Why not? I was obviously I jumped at the chance, like of course.
Yeah.
So for the new film, I actually created a picture book with illustrator Nicholas Smith, and the book is actually canon. So for those who don't know what canon means, the book exists within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like the character I created for this book exists within the Marvel Cinematic Universe now, and the book directly ties into the second film.
Wow. That's awesome, man.
Yeah, yeah,
That's awesome. Really freaking cool, man. That's
yeah.
fantastic. Well, we'll definitely get a copy of that and make sure that my little guys see it, and and obviously, watches movies and stuff, because
Of
he's
course.
he's totally into that too. So that's really cool, buddy. That's really, really cool. So Fred, we covered lots of places here. We talked about the Black Friend, we talked about, Patriarchy Blues, we talked about, Better Than You Found It, the next book, and then Wakanda Forever here, the Black Panther book and such. So what, like, obviously you spend a ton of time creating content and doing stuff like that, but when
Mhm.
you're not, when you're not like heads down doing that, man, what else, what do you do for fun, Fred? Like, how do you keep yourself entertained?
I love writing, right? Like obviously, you have to
Yeah.
love it to do it, but I truly love writing. I think that I'm refinding my passion for writing in some of the projects that I'm working on right now. I'm working on my first novel, so that comes out I think in a year and a half or 2 years or something like that. I'm working on another nonfiction project. I'm working on some picture books, and so that's one thing. But I'm a big sports guy, right? I think that sometimes because I do talk so much and so often about some of the issues in our society, people forget that I'm a total human being, right? Like I'm a big Lakers guy, I'm a big Mets guy. I love film, I love music. I guess if you look behind me on my left hand side, there's vinyls right there. Stevie Wonder, Tyler the Creator. There's Steely Dan on there, et cetera, right? Like I'm really into music. So I do the things that everybody else does. I'm just probably extremely passionate about a lot of them.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So Lakers, are they going to get Kyrie and trade away Russ? I mean, what do you think, Fred?
No, I think that's done. I think that's done, and I'm not mad at it. I actually, it's weird. So obviously, you're a fan of NBA. Then I love Russell Westbrook as a person. Obviously, horrible year last year, but I'm kind of like, he's in the last year of his contract. Run it back, see what happens. We're not going to put a team together that's a championship contender anyway. So why not just keep it as it is? Don't mortgage the future. Have a fun year, not a championship year, and then figure out what you do the following year when he's gone. So,
Cool. I'm for that. Well, and I'm a Darvin Ham fan. He played for my Milwaukee Bucks. So I'm a Ham,
hey,
right?
oh, yeah.
Ham Slamwich, right? So he played. Yeah, I remember watching him play at the Bradley Center years ago. So that's pretty fun,
Oh,
man.
you're a
So
Bucks fan. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I
Well, so I'm
respect that.
originally from Wisconsin. Well, I'm originally from Wisconsin. So
Uh-huh.
I grew up. So I'm older than you, Fred. I grew up watching Jack Sikma and Paul Mokeski and Sidney
Uh,
Moncrief, right? I mean, Terry. I remember Terry Cummings and Craig Hodges. Played for us before he played for the Bulls.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So so we had some really good teams, man. We just were 50. We're Don Nelson with his stupid sad fish
Uh-huh.
ties, right? I mean, that was terrible, man. But he'd drive around the state in a tractor. I mean, yeah, we won't talk about that.
Yeah, I have
So
I have a close friend he's from Wisconsin and currently is back living in Wisconsin with his children and his family, and he's a big Bucks fan. I I think the Bucks are the only team that I like watching succeed other than my own team. You know, I love Giannis. You know, I just love that team. I love those guys, Middleton, and it's just a great. They're a great energy. So congrats.
Yeah, I think no, I think so too. It's super cool. I mean, sadly, I moved away before the championship,
uh,
before the Deer District was built, even.
oh
So,
wow.
I've been gone 7 years now. So it's but I cheer for my home teams. I don't cheer for the Packers now, though. I cheer for my Buccaneers because I'm
Uh-huh,
down in Florida. But
uh-huh.
anyway, so cool, man. So Fred, as we wrap this up, if people want to, want to get started, like maybe, taking a good step to having a better tomorrow and being more aware of stuff. Obviously, I'm going to put up your website. Folks should read your books and get to know you more for sure. But is there one or two action items, Fred, that they can take to maybe make things a little bit better right now?
Yeah, I think the first action item is having an honest conversation with yourself and looking in the mirror every day and deciding to choose progress, right? I think too often people think that progress, and however progress fits into your life or what you think the word means, but people too often think that progress is one action, right? Like people think that progress is reading a book or watching a documentary or going to a march or something like that. And no, it's a road, right? It's a road that you walk on, and if you choose to walk on it, you should walk on it for the rest of your life. So I think that's the first action, is having an honest conversation about making room for this in your entire life. I think the second action is begin learning, right? Like begin learning, like start with the book, start with the documentary, like start somewhere, but learn so that you can begin to unlearn all the things that you have wrongfully potentially believed before, because all of us in some way have been given, taught, you know, handed the wrong things throughout our life. So
Good. Yeah, those are actionable things, right? Have an honest conversation with yourself. The choose progress is great. Start learning so that you can unlearn the ways or remove some of the ignorance from your world. That I think that's great too. And definitely, friends, if you're listening, you're watching, get to know Fred Joseph. He's fantastic. He's a great follow on Instagram, Fred T. Joseph. If you go to his website, it's frederickjoseph.com, spelled traditionally there. Check him out. Get to know Fred. Lots of good stuff. I would recommend read Patriarchy Blues. I read it on the beach. It's it's something, man. It's a tough book and a great book. Like I read some of those essays. I'm like, oh man, that's hard. Like
yeah,
hard stuff, man. Hard stuff. So kudos to you. And then check out Black Panther Wakanda Forever for sure, right? That's easy stuff.
yeah.
We can do that. I'm going to take my little guy to see that. But Fred, I just so appreciate who you are. I appreciate you standing up. I appreciate all that you teach me without probably even knowing it. So I just want to say thanks, man.
Well, Phil, I appreciate it, and thanks for having me. And I hope that all of us can be on this journey together, and that's the entire point. So here's to all of us being in community.
Amen. All of us in community choosing progress.